probably developed an interest in religious instruction classes. I came to it, I think, probably differently to other people, in that I think most people who were interested in that were probably interested in religious education in general, or they have they're parents of kids in schools and so on. I am a parent myself, and I have kids in their government school. I became aware of the controversy around the religious instruction classes about 2010, I think, and it was because of the controversy in New South Wales when they introduced ethics classes as an alternative for kids who sit out of religious instruction in government primary schools. And that's because one of my area of expertise is philosophy for children, and the ethics classes were developed by experts in philosophy for children. In fact, the first trial ethics classes in New South Wales, which I think was 2010, were developed by my former PhD supervisor, Phil Cam. So that's how I became aware of the whole thing. So initially I just thought they were running these ethics classes in government schools, and didn't realise until the controversy erupted that they were being offered as an alternative to kids who were sitting out of religious instruction classes. I had no idea that they offered religious instruction classes in government schools. I just assumed that was something you'd only do in a independent, in a religious school. And then, of course, there was a lot of sort of controversy and media coverage of that whole debate, because when they offered the ethics classes, some religious groups, certainly not all of them, opposed those ethics classes because they thought it created competition for, I think in New South Wales it's called special religious education, and also I think that it wasn't just that it created competition. I think they thought it was unfair because it would force children from religious families to have to choose between going to scripture class and then going to this ethics class that their friends might be going to that might look fun, and it created an unfair situation for them. And previously the New South Wales Education Act had specifically forbid schools from offering alternatives like actually named ethics, and I think also things like civics classes and stuff. Specifically said schools were not allowed to run alternatives like ethics, secular ethics, for that very reason, is that it would set up a sort of conflict for religious children whose parents were religious, and it put them into scripture classes. So in order to actually introduce those ethics classes properly, they had to amend that part of the Education Act, and there was a lot of backlash against that, and the parliamentary inquiry and so on. So a lot of the controversy was, in New South Wales, but also in Victoria around that time, because it was mandatory for schools. Well, the Department of Education told schools they had to offer RI classes. The Education Act didn't clearly stipulate that. And then also in Queensland, which is the other state where schools are required to offer RI. In all the other states and territories, government schools can offer it, but it's not mandatory, so there's not much controversy in those states and territories, and there's not too much debate about it there. All the controversy's been in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. Victoria, there's no controversy at the moment, because soon after the Labor government was elected, I think it was about 2013, they removed it. It said it could still be run, but only during lunchtime or before and after school. And as a result, not so many schools offer it now, and there's no real issue because I don't think anyone minds what people do before and after school or in lunchtime, because it's kind of your own time anyway. So if kids want to go to RI then, I don't think there's any real issue with that. Although the opposition party has said if they're re-elected, they'll bring it back in, so then we'll probably have the controversy. We might have the controversy back here. So because it's such there's so much controversy around it, and it upsets a lot of people, it's something then worth researching and looking into, because it's clearly a problem that hasn't been resolved by any of the, such as in New South Wales, offering ethics classes hasn't fully resolved the issue. because there's still students who don't attend ethics or religious instruction. It's hard to get volunteers to come in and run ethics classes, so not all schools can offer them. And there's plenty of kids from religious minority backgrounds who don't want to do, or their parents don't want them to do either ethics or the RI, that's the religious classes in their school, which are predominantly Christian. It can be hard to get scripture classes in minority religions. So it's still, the most simple solution seems to be, sort of what Victoria did, whereas it can only be run outside normal class hours, or it's just not mandatory for schools to run it. What a lot of people, tended to focus on was a lot of the people who will. There's not a lot of academics working on this topic, for starters, and the ones that were tended to focus more on law and policy issues, and also social inclusion. So that issue about how fair is it when, say, students from religious minorities can't access scripture. There wasn't a lot of people focusing on the educational value of the religious instruction classes and the materials, learning materials and the content and the pedagogy used in those classes. And that's my area of expertise, is curriculum and philosophy of education. And so I thought, well, that's a gap, and something I could look at there was, well, what is the educational value of these classes? So, for example, in Queensland in 2016, the government undertook a review of religious instruction materials used in Queensland, but that review focused on whether the materials were compliant with Queensland policy and laws. It didn't look too much at whether the materials were actually of any educational value, or did they, were they any good? So, in the sense that did they foster legitimate learning and, help children become more autonomous and, critical thinkers who could function, good citizens, and all those sorts of educational ideas. It's just not what the focus was. So I thought, and then in 2019, a group representing various religious organisations also started to review those materials, but the same thing, they just focused on whether it was compliant with policy and law. And of course, the policy and law itself may not be any good, so I think that's a pretty limited review. So what we want to do is look at the educational value of those materials and the sorts of, pedagogies and content used, and whether that's worthwhile having that in schools at all. In terms of then looking at the content of the classes and the type of pedagogy or the teaching methods used, so one of the obvious things to look at then, because it's a common criticism of religious education, is there any indoctrination involved, or does it look like indoctrination? And so that criticism gets thrown around a lot. People will often say, they'll just say it's indoctrination and we shouldn't have indoctrination in schools. But the notion of indoctrination is complex. It's been it's contested, and it's been theorised by philosophers of education for quite a while, especially going back to for a long time, but there's a lot of literature sort of from the 1960s and 70s about, well, what is indoctrination and why is it bad? And as a philosopher of education, I thought, well, that's one thing I can contribute to by looking at what does it actually mean to indoctrinate? Why is it considered immoral? And then let's apply that theory to looking at what we know about RI, or what people have said about it, and seeing does it look like indoctrination? Is that a problem? So that's one thing we're looking at. So we're using a sort of, a notion of indoctrination, or mostly extending on it, an idea from a philosopher of education, Ivan Snook, whose work was from the 70s, but which Snook says, a teacher indoctrinates if they intend to teach in such a way that students would come to hold beliefs regardless of the evidence, something like that, along those lines. But essentially, you're intending to teach students in such a way that they'll hold some belief regardless of whether there's evidence for it or not, and in an uncritical, typically works that you would come out holding the beliefs in an uncritical, dogmatic way, which could be difficult. If it was successful, it'd be difficult for someone to persuade you otherwise, because you didn't come to hold those beliefs based on reasons or evidence. So we'd be it might be hard to persuade you using reason and evidence to change those views. So, which also shows you why indoctrination then would be considered harmful and immoral, because it can lead to people who just sort of, can be easily manipulated and, closely associated with brainwashing and things like that too. So it's a way to sort of, control people and not take away their ability to think for themselves and to look at alternative perspectives and make real decisions. So it takes away capacities for critical thinking and autonomy, which we think are essential, to leading a good life and, being a functioning person in the world and making choices for yourself. And we have to look like, well, what does it look like then in practice? So if someone was trying to indoctrinate, Snook says, if we want to see if some teacher's trying to indoctrinate, they're probably not going to admit to it, so we can't, because it's known to be immoral. So how would we know what some teacher's intent is? Like, we can't read their mind. So we would look at the sort of content they're teaching and the methods they're using, and we draw a kind of inference about, does this look like their intention is to indoctrinate or not? And common things you would see then is they're trying to teach content that is controversial, where there's no clear evidence to support the viewpoints. Because if you had evidence, you'd use that to persuade people, so you wouldn't, you wouldn't want them to accept the belief regardless of the evidence. You'd want them to accept it because of the evidence. So that's why it's more common, and it's associated with not just religious education, but moral education and political education, things where the content is, controversial or highly contentious. So if they're teaching that sort of content, and if they're using methods that are non-rational, that aim to bypass reasoning and critical thinking, would be in conjunction with controversial content, that would be, an indicator that they might be trying to indoctrinate. So non-rational methods could include, like you mentioned, the use of fear. So, and we've seen lots of complaints with RI and through different research and also some of the reviews about things like kids being told, if you don't go to scripture, you'll go to hell, or if you don't believe, I can't remember exactly, but along those lines of, if you don't accept this belief, you could go to hell. So stuff that's could be frightening. So that could look like, right? It could, depends how you interpret it, but that could look like, attempts at indoctrination if you're using fear or emotions to get someone to believe something or adhere to something, as opposed to reason and evidence. So that could be an indication that someone is trying to indoctrinate. Other examples might be, just using really, things like rote learning or really teacher-centered learning, which can be fine. That's not always indoctrination. That's perfectly good. If you're trying to memorize your times tables, we wouldn't say that's indoctrination. It's an effective way to do that, to memorize them over and over again. But if I saw someone having kids memorize passages of the Communist Manifesto, I might be a little alarmed. I might think that's rote learning to get them to learn perhaps something that's controversial and should be, not taught in that way, should be taught through, critical thinking and so on. If I see rote learning as a way to get kids to learn stuff that's contentious, that's problematic, and that could be an indication of indoctrination. So that's what we're looking at. So do we see evidence of these sorts of things in, RI materials and in the reviews and research that's been done so far? I'm a Jewish scholar, what's known as a Jewish scholar, in that I study and write about the philosopher John Dewey, who was an American classical pragmatist philosopher, whose most famous book is the book Democracy in Education. He was very, very influential during his lifetime, but still today. And so that's where I've used his theory to sort of outline what I think are some fundamental aims of education. And I think the key one, and I don't think, not everyone's a Jewian, but I don't think that his aims would be particularly controversial. I think most people would agree with them in some form. Which is, the key one is that schooling aims to develop in students the capacity for inquiry, which could be synonymous with words like reflective thinking or even critical thinking or just problem solving. And so the reason that capacity is so fundamental is we need it basically for everything to function well in the world. So He was influenced by evolutionary theory, which was, how do people grow and develop and survive? It's that when I encounter conflict or problems, I come into conflict with my environment, and I've got to work out how to overcome that conflict in order to sort of just survive, or to create meaning, or to, achieve whatever my aims are. It provokes the capacity for inquiry, which is, and it's modelled on basically what we think of as scientific methods of inquiry. I have a problem, I consider hypotheses, I critically compare those hypotheses, I test them out, and so on. So it's that capacity to think for myself. And in particular, he said, because we live in an environment with other people, we need the capacity for communal inquiry, because other people can be obstacles or supporters. I got to take into account their views and aims and what they're doing as well in order to function well. And so we need the capacity to engage in inquiry with others. That means expressing opinions, coming up with common problems, trying to come up with solutions we agree upon, evaluating each other's opinions, being open to criticism, being able to change my mind, revise ideas when I'm provoked to by the reasons and arguments of others, all those sorts of things. So these are the fundamental aims of education, to develop that capacity for communal inquiry. So you can see if RI does indeed, religious instruction, if it does indeed indoctrinate, indoctrination absolutely undermines that capacity, because it's trying to bypass that capacity altogether. It's trying to get people to accept beliefs and not think about them, not be critical, not evaluate them. It's trying to get those beliefs in your head without that inquiry taking place, and it can discourage. If it's effective, it would discourage that capacity altogether. So that's why we would not. So that's the kind of thing. If it's correct that religious instruction classes involve indoctrination, that should be pretty. If we had evidence that was serious concerns that was the case, we should definitely not want that in schools then.